So in this lecture, we're going to colorize this photo of Abraham Lincoln. Colorization in Photoshop is fairly simple, but if you're trying to achieve photorealistic looking results, there are a few additional steps you want to do. And we're going to cover those in this lesson, so let's get started. Okay, now for the fun part. Let's go ahead and colorize this image. Now for this demonstration, we're going to be using two different colorization techniques. One technique we're going to use for the clothing and the background, and the other technique we're going to use for the skin tones. So let's start with the background. First thing we want to do is make certain that we are in RGB mode. If I come up here into mode, you can see that this image is still in grayscale because this is the original color space that it was in when I downloaded it. So let's move that to RGB color. It's asking me if I want to flatten the image. I do not want to flatten this image. I want to preserve my layers, and I'm going to group these layers together, the layers that I use for retouching, into one group, and I'm going to rename it retouching. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is paint in the background, and I'm going to start by first making a selection with the quick selection tool, and I'm just going to select the background here. Now with the background selected, what I want to do is create a solid color adjustment layer. Now you'll notice that when I do this, it not only creates an adjustment layer, but it uses that selection that I made to create a layer mask. So it saves me a step. Now from here, I can just dial in whatever color I want. So let's start with this. I click OK. Now here's the key. In order for this to blend, what I need to do is change the mode from normal to color. Now if I don't like this color, I can double click this, go back into my color picker, and change it to whatever color I want. So maybe something like that will work. I'll click OK. Okay, that works for the background. I want to make sure that I name this, and we'll call this background. We're going to be adding a lot of layers here, so it's a good idea to keep everything named and in order. Okay, so now let's work on his clothing. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to use the quick select tool to make a quick selection. And then we'll create another solid color adjustment layer. I'll come back here to my color mode, change this to color, and then I'm going to name this jacket and pants. And then I'll double click on this to dial in the exact color I want. I can either use this here to change the hue. I can also type in the values numerically, or if I hold down Command and hover over, I can slide this back and forth to change the hue. So maybe we'll do something like that, and maybe raise up the saturation just a little bit. Okay, looks good. Now I want to go back in and clean up this layer mask. So I'm going to select the layer mask and then come back in here. So if white reveals and black conceals, what do I want to do? I want to paint with black. So I will switch to black and activate my paintbrush, and I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to paint black onto the mask. And I'm just doing a really quick job here because I can go back in later and re-edit this mask and make finer adjustments. And once we're finished with the jacket, we'll go ahead and make another adjustment layer for the vest. And you'll notice that this quick selection tool doesn't do the best job of creating a selection, but because this is a layer mask, I can come back in here if I need to later on and just kind of fine tune it. I can paint back in with white to add more to the selection, or I can paint with black to take it away. And what I like to do whenever I add in color, I always like to pull the opacity back just a little bit, just to bring in a little bit of the original. And we'll do the same with the jacket. Now we'll do the tie, same as before. We're gonna go to our quick select tool. We're gonna make a selection and then come over here to color, solid color, And this one we're going to make the tie a red color. Click OK. We're going to change this to color mode. And that tie is really crazy, so let's dial this down a little bit. I definitely want to dial down the saturation, so I'm holding down Command and hovering over the saturation. And I also want to change the hue. So again, holding down Command and just sliding until I find a color that I like. That red looks like that's gonna work. Lower the brightness just a little bit and then lower the opacity just a little bit more. We're gonna name that one tie. This will be the vest. So going back to this vest layer, I don't want this chain to be colorized, so I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to paint with black, and I'm going to paint with black. I'm going to paint out that color, and looks like I've overshot it a little bit. I'm going to hit X to paint with white, so I'm going to bring some of it back in. Whenever I'm doing this, I typically have my left hand on X, my right hand on the mouse. This allows me again to toggle back and forth between these two, the black and the white. Super handy when you're working with layer masks. So the last thing I want to do is add just a little bit of color to the shirt. The shirt is completely white, and I'm also going to colorize the table. Now when colorizing skin, I've seen a lot of people use just a color mode method. I'm not a fan of using this technique for the face because I feel like it looks much more realistic if you use a palette of colors rather than a single color. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a palette of skin tones. So we're going to come up with 3 colors. We're going to define a highlight skin tone, a mid-tone skin tone, and a shadow skin tone. So here's how we're going to do that. So rather than coming up with these colors from scratch, I think the easier method is to just sample from another image. So we're going to go onto Google Images here, and we're going to just search for a random portrait. Let's search for a portrait of Brad Pitt. Really, any portrait will do. Let's go with this one. So let's import this into our document. We'll first create a new layer, and now we're going to use the eyedropper. Make sure that the eyedropper sample size is set to 5x5 average, not point sample. We're going to start first by selecting a sample from the brightest part of his face, and that would be the highlight area of his face. And then we're going to use the paintbrush tool to paint that color onto the skin tones layer that we created. We're going to come back here again, hold down Option to bring up the eyedropper, and we're going to select a midtone. So something in between the highlight and the shadow, maybe something like that. And we're going to paint that in here. And now we're going to select a shadow area. That would be this right here, and we're going to paint that in. Okay, so we have a highlight, a midtone, and a shadow. And we can go ahead and delete that layer. We don't need that anymore. Okay, so now that we have our skin tones, let's create a selection of the face. We'll do that with the quick selection tool. This is definitely not my favorite tool, but it is a fast way of making a selection. Now, in order to colorize the face, we're going to come down here to adjustment layer, and instead of choosing solid color like we did before, this time we're going to select gradient map. We're going to set the layer mode to color. You should see the properties tab. We double click on the properties, and that brings up the gradient editor. So in the gradient editor, you can see the gradient goes from foreground to background color. We're going to add a third color in there. These 2 squares on the bottom left and bottom right are known as color stops. And we can add an additional color stop by clicking in between. Now just for illustrative purposes, I'm going to add in some pretty radical colors in here just so we can see how the gradient map is going to transition from one color to the next on the actual image. And you can see here the effect that the gradient map has on the image. And as I slide these over, you can see that it changes the intensity of the transition from one color to another. So now that we know how a gradient map works, let's go ahead and swap out these colors for the actual skin tones. So we're first going to change out the highlight color. We're going to select color, and then from the color picker, we're going to select our highlight skin tone. Click OK. We're going to do that for the second color. That's going to be our mid-tone skin tone. And then for our third color, that will be our shadow skin tone. And you can see here that we don't have just one skin tone here. We have a transition from a lighter skin tone to a darker skin tone. and it just gives it a bit more of a natural look. So I'm manipulating the color stops here, and I'm trying to create a skin tone that looks as realistic as possible. And when I like what I see, I go ahead and click apply. And I'll come back here to my gradient mask and touch up the mask itself a little bit. Go ahead and mask out the eyes. So the photo looks a little too saturated, so I'm going to create another adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to create a hue and saturation adjustment layer and bring down the saturation just a touch. Okay, and now the last thing left to do is the finishing touches. I'm going to go back in and work on the hair a little bit, colorize the eyes, refine some of the masks, and just add a little bit more detail to the photo. Alright, so the very last thing I'm going to add here is an overall lighting effect. This is going to be a global change to the entire image. So I'm going to create another solid color adjustment layer, but instead of changing the layer mode to color, I'm going to instead change it to soft light. And I'm going to reduce this down to about 25% or so. Okay, so as you can see, that's added some warmth to the image. Here's the before, and here's the after. Just gives a little bit more warmth. Okay, the very final last thing I want to do with this is come back in here into the levels layer and bring this down a little bit. What you'll notice sometimes is when you keep adding layers, and with all of the changes, with all the additional modes and adjustment layers added, sometimes you'll actually affect the tonal range of the image, and I've done so here. So I want to come back into the levels adjustment layer. I'm going to come back in here and bring back just a little bit of that highlight detail and brighten it up just a touch. And so we've brought back some of the detail there. Okay, so in this demonstration, we were able to colorize a black and white image using two different types of adjustment layers, a solid color adjustment layer and a gradient map adjustment layer. And so let's look at the difference here. Here's the before, and this is the after.